Welcome to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton here on this Monday, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Hope you all had a great weekend, maybe enjoyed some football, some time with the family, nice relaxation, a break from the craziness in the world and probably in your own personal lives as well, as we head into this 2020 election cycle of which the impeachment is inextricably interlinked. I want to start today. We'll talk about a few different things. I want to pick up on some threads that we talked about on Thursday and Friday. In particular, we're going to talk about the Afghanistan papers, maybe the most overlooked critical story that has emerged about not only American national security and foreign policy, but also what kind of government we have and whether we're really represented ultimately when there are trillions of dollars in treasure and all of this blood sacrificed, and what have we gotten for it? And I talked about the link between General Michael Flynn and those Afghanistan papers last week. We'll pick up on that thread today as well with Julie Kelly just a little bit later in the hour. We're also going to, again, look at China, but actually through the lens of Taiwan, country we don't talk about a lot, but which is actually the front line in the Chinese Communist Party's march, first for regional hegemony and then for global dominance. And why should we as Americans care about that? And what should the U.S. relationship with Taiwan look like? And there were recently presidential and broader elections there as well, which have not gotten a lot of press in the U.S., but are actually quite significant and a good news out of that part of the world. So we'll talk with Steve Yates about that a little bit later in the show. And then we'll also talk with Margot Cleveland of The Federalist, a senior contributor there, colleague of mine, who is doing some exceptional work parsing, going through page by page of the 478 pages or whatever it is of the IG report on FISA abuse, and also looking at potential corruption in the FISA court itself. Huge, vital matters that are not being addressed. People are not going in and doing the journalistic homework that they ought to do, and Margot has a very extensive legal background, looks at this through the eyes of our eyes, the way that we look at these issues, and is doing some vital work on this. So we'll talk about that in hour 3. But I want to start with this being Martin Luther King Jr. Day, a little bit about the politics of this. And I don't believe that national holidays should be politicized. I think that politics should be taken out of all of these major cultural benchmarks, these celebrations that we have. But the left has injected politics into everything. So if we're going to talk about the political aspect of a day like Martin Luther King Day, I would suggest that this should be an anti-identity politics holiday, because that is actually what Martin Luther King Jr. espoused. Certainly in the most famous speech he ever delivered, he talked about colorblindness, content of character mattering more than color of skin pigmentation, that you and I have no control over that. What we do have control over is what we contribute to society, to our families, to our communities, what we bring to the table based upon our individual merit. And that truly is the basis by which we should be judged, not things that are completely out of our control, arbitrary by nature. Thomas Sowell, the great economist who grew up in Harlem back, I believe, in the 30s or 40s, came up through the ranks of basically militant black nationalism, leftism, had an epiphany and switched and became one of this nation's leading free market economists, written some of the finest books there are on these subjects. And he wrote something back in 2013 on the 50th anniversary of King's I Have a Dream speech that I think is worth reading at some length, because it puts in context how distorted Americans, particularly on the left, have gotten on issues of race, how far away they have traveled from Martin Luther King's ideal, where colorblindness used to be the highest ideal, the virtue that we sought, the principle that we sought. And now what is deemed most virtuous is the opposite. It is, let's judge everything explicitly on the basis of what the race is of one person versus another person. That's really identity politics and multiculturalism. What, at the end of the day, is it really about? Yes, they've come up with this academic veneer to try to rationalize the views that have pervaded our law schools and all of our schools and now all of our cultural institutions since the civil rights era. It's actually about dividing us. It's about dividing us and then conquering us. Rubbing the wounds, old wounds, historical wounds, for political gain. Playing one group, and I hate the term group because we're individuals and we should be judged individually. Pitting groups against each other. And that is totally antithetical to what King argued in that speech. I want to read a little of what Sowell said back in 2013 because it's just as relevant today, and it's going to remain just as relevant until and unless we thwart the identity politics obsessed, multiculturalist focused march and get back to judging people by who they are, caring most about the smallest minority, the minority of one, the individual. Under assault by this group ideology of identity politics, which of course is just a ruse, a guise to cover their leftism. It's using the veneer of being virtuous because you're supporting the oppressed as a means of justifying tyrannical collectivism where the individual is destroyed, the smallest minority is destroyed. Here's a little of what Sowell wrote. Judging individuals by their individual character is at the opposite pole from judging how groups are statistically represented among employees, college students, or political figures. Yet many, if not most, of those who celebrate the I Have a Dream speech today promote the directly opposite approach of group preferences, especially those based on skin color. He goes on, what was historic about King's speech was not only what was said, but how powerfully its message resonated among Americans of that time across the spectrum of race, ideology, and politics. A higher percentage of Republicans than Democrats voted in Congress for both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. To say that was a hopeful time would be an understatement. To say that many of those hopes have since been disappointed would also be an understatement. There's been much documented racial progress since 1963, but there's also been much retrogression, of which the disintegration of the black family has been central, especially among those at the bottom of the social pyramid. Many people, especially politicians and activists, want to take credit for the economic and other advancement of blacks, even though a larger proportion of blacks rose out of poverty in the 20 years before 1960 than the 20 years afterwards. We should add to that these trends have only gotten worse, and that the Great Society itself, when measured in terms of the racial progress, has really been a flop. But no one wants to take responsibility for the policies and ideologies that led to the breakup of the black family, which had survived centuries of slavery and generations of discrimination. And we cannot downplay enough, by the way, the disintegration of the black family is a trend that has accelerated across Americans of all races. And the disintegration of family ultimately means the disintegration of communities, society, and a nation altogether, because absent that family structure, everything else collapses. He goes on, many hopes were disappointed because those were unrealistic hopes to begin with. Economic and other disparities between groups have been common for centuries in countries around the world, and many of those disparities have been and still are larger than the disparities between blacks and whites in America. Even when those who lagged behind have advanced, they have not always caught up even after centuries, because others were advancing at the same time. But when blacks did not catch up with whites in America within a matter of decades, that was treated as strange, or even a sinister sign of crafty and covert racism. Civil rights were necessary, but far from sufficient. Education and job skills are crucial, and the government cannot give you these things. All it can do is make them available. Race hustlers who blame all lags on the racism of others are among the obstacles to taking the fullest advantage of education and other opportunities. What does that say about the content of their character? Sowell goes on a little bit to talk about the passage of the Civil Rights Act and how high hopes were following that act. He says, the bitter anticlimax that did follow provoked no rethinking. Instead, it provoked all sorts of new demands. Judging everybody by the same standards came to be regarded in some quarters as racist, because it precluded preferences and quotas. That is, we should judge everyone by different standards, and that's supposed to be anti-racist? It's absurd on its face. Sowell goes on, there are people today who talk justice when they really mean payback, including payback against people who were not even born when historic injustices were committed. By the way, this applies to a criminal justice system, for example, in New York, where I mentioned we now have this no bail reform. where criminals get protected under the guise of justice, but innocent victims walking the streets have to deal with these repeat offenders going out and committing all sorts of crimes through no fault of their own. And the criminal is treated as the aggrieved. So it pervades a lot of things. It's not just the racial relations in this country. Soul concludes, and this was talking back in 2013, remember? So this was the Trayvon whole hullabaloo, Trayvon Martin case transpiring. The nation has just been through a sensationalized murder trial in Florida on which many people took fierce positions before a speck of evidence was introduced based on nothing more than judging those involved by the color of their skin. President Obama did that himself, by the way, in the case of the Trayvon Martin travails tragedy. We have a long way to go to catch up to what Martin Luther King said 50 years ago, and we are moving in the opposite direction. And I think the record absolutely proves what Thomas Sowell was saying. Take, for example, something we've talked about on this show before, the 1619 Project. This is a project by the New York Times to reframe history as if American history really begins when slavery was introduced to the shores of, at the time, Virginia. And slavery actually had existed here decades, if not a century or more, prior to that point. But that is the point at which the New York Times traces our history. So 1776 isn't the start of America. 1619 is. Our original sin of slavery is. That's where American history should start. So it suggests from the very beginning that we were built on tyranny, not liberty, and that every evil aspect of America derives from this original evil seed of slavery being introduced here, rather than the fact that America was an experiment in liberty, where slavery was the great exception to it, where the founding fathers themselves said it was basically intolerable, completely incompatible with what our founding principles were, completely incompatible with the Declaration of Independence, with the Constitution, not referenced in the Constitution by name, because they knew that it was a blight on our nation. And most of the founders, in particular the abolitionist founders, all said basically they found this to be an abhorrent system, one that had to be tolerated or there would not be a union. And then they had language specifically in the Constitution to phase out the slave trade within 25 years. The document itself, of course, could not support slavery on its own merits, on the words in it. But the Times, instead, wants to reframe our history and introduce a curriculum into schools consistent with the 1619 Project, which explicitly says that America was basically a country founded on and built in tyranny, that capitalism and all of our other institutions spawn from it, that ultimately it is a deplorable experiment. And if it's a deplorable, evil experiment, then obviously the answer is you have to turn it on its head. You have to shred the Constitution. You have to repudiate the Declaration of Independence. These documents aren't viewed as the answers to discrimination and to a society that is flourishing and tolerant and truly pluralistic and judges people on their merits like King asked for and like Douglas identified centuries before, over a century before. They'd have us believe it's the exact opposite. Totally inconsistent, I would argue, the 1619 Project with what King called for. And Robert Woodson wrote a great editorial on this in the Wall Street Journal recently, and he talked about 1619. He said that today the progressive left wants to ignore the achievements and pretend that blacks are perpetual victims of white racism. The 1619 Project essay series is the latest salvo in this attack on America's founding, claiming anti-black racism runs in the very DNA of this country. This statement is an abomination of everything Dr. King stood for. When we come right back, we'll talk a little bit more about Dr. King, 1619 Project and context of it, and the importance of the content of character over the color of skin. Right back. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show. Back in just a second. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. We've been talking about the ideals and principles that Martin Luther King stood for, and the left standing in contradiction to those principles today, sadly. And I was talking about this Robert Woodson Wall Street Journal editorial, and he quotes from King and juxtaposes it with the 1619 Project. He says, in sharp contrast to the claims of 1619, which disparages the American Revolution and Declaration of Independence and insists America is hopelessly racist, King believed deeply in the need to remain true to the founder's vision, quoting him, "the patriot dream that sees beyond the years." To him, that was that was the only avenue toward fulfilling America's promise, as he wrote in his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what was best in the American dream and for the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby bringing our nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the Founding Fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Okay, well, our leftists today who would claim to carry the banner of King say that the Constitution and the Declaration are inherently evil documents based upon the people that drafted them and what they derive from. Judeo-Christian heritage, they'd say that's code word for white nationalism and ethnocentric Europeanism and these other asinine concepts that they've come up with to try to create an academic veneer that legitimizes their just anti-Western ideology at its core. Our sacred American values and the American dream. Our understanding of the American dream as conservative Americans, as traditional Americans, is the American nightmare in the left's reading of things. King added, "We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with America's destiny." And then Woodson goes on, "Dr. King, who sought full participation in America, would never have indulged today's grievance-based identity politics whose social justice warriors use race as a battering ram against the country. In fact, in a letter from Birmingham jail, King explicitly warned against the type of groupthink that characterizes identity politics. Individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture," said King. "But as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups tend to be more immoral than individuals." I'd say to the left, how can you look at what King said and what he wrote, and then support an ideology that is inherently about color of skin, maybe to the total exclusion of content of character, certainly to some extent to the exclusion of content of character, but merit and the individual worth and dignity of a person should be all that matters at the end of the day in America. And we might not always achieve that ideal, but that should be the ideal, not the opposite, not the antithesis. We're going to switch gears here, and just after the break, we're going to have Julie Kelly on to talk about something I talked about last week, which does deal, incidentally, with our individual liberties and civil rights, in context of General Michael Flynn, certainly, and also in context of the government versus the people in the Afghanistan papers. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on The Buck Sexton Show. Back just after this. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. And as you'll recall, on Friday, we did a very deep dive into the plight of General Michael T. Flynn, and in particular, went into great depth on what I think is a document that in and of itself explains why Flynn had to be targeted as persona non grata, the number one priority for the deep staters in the Trump administration, based on this one interview alone. And that interview was a product of the Afghanistan papers, one that was flagged for me by a great writer, one of the best trolls, certainly, on the conservative side, but also someone who writes just fantastic editorials and does some great journalistic work. And that's Julie Kelly, a senior contributor to American Greatness, and she joins us now. Julie, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me on.
Well, it's my pleasure. And I want to start actually with a news story that I'm sure you saw. You know, one of these stories rolled out once or twice a week. This one about just these bombshell revelations about President Trump defying the generals and other senior officials in the administration, in particular, leading national security and foreign policy officials. Wonder if you put that, well, first of all, isn't that what he was elected to do?
Right. He absolutely was. And, he was right to question. We all support the military. We know what a hard job they've all had the past 2 decades, from Afghanistan through Iraq and other conflicts. But look, we now know, thanks to the expose that's been published in the Washington Post, what a debacle the Afghanistan war has been from the beginning. And Trump promised his base and his voters that he would look to end these perpetual wars. And I think that that was the crux of his questioning of these military officials in 2017.
And incidentally, that questioning, I think, perfectly parallels what General Flynn asserted in his interview with the special inspector general for the Afghanistan reconstruction efforts, because basically what he was calling out is, look, we spent now $7 trillion in treasure and all manner of blood, and at the end of the day, what did we get for it? What is the return on the investment of our nation's resources? I wonder if you would summarize for us what you've found in parsing the Afghanistan papers thus far.
Well, just so everyone can understand where these papers came from. So this is, as you said, the Special Inspector General who was tasked in 2008 really to look at all the reconstruction efforts, what's been going on in Afghanistan since really 2002 after the invasion. So this Special Inspector General has conducted hundreds of interviews, not just with U.S. officials, but allied forces and Afghan government officials as well, looking into, what worked and what didn't work. And unfortunately, we found out that most of what we've been doing there has not worked. So these interviews give really some insight into, what has been happening for almost 2 decades. And one of those interviews was Mike Flynn, who has been an intelligence officer for decades and served in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And so he also worked in the Obama administration for James Clapper. So his interview was very interesting, and we can get into some of the details. But it makes more sense of why the Obama White House targeted him in 2014.
Yeah, it's amazing in some ways, to my mind, that he rose to be the head of DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, under
Right.
the Obama administration, given his outspoken views. The only thing to which I can attribute it is really that he was so competent that competence overcame the political correctness that would normally pervade a decision, like elevating him to that role. Do you see it that way as well?
I think that that's true. And, his experience really is unmatched. And so, but he was sounding the alarm early on at how the intelligence was being manipulated and politicized coming out of Afghanistan, and how it was causing people to make really bad decisions. And he alerted not just the Obama White House, but also CIA officials. I believe it was probably John Brennan because, they weren't exactly equals, but pretty close. And questioning why the intelligence was being manipulated and politicized. And as it got higher up the chain, meaning to the president, he was not getting the truth. Therefore, he was not telling the American people the truth either.
And thus far in reviewing those Afghanistan papers, what's been the most remarkable thing that you've found?
Ben, I have to say, these are a lot of the same people, and I'm going to have a piece on this later in the week as well. These are the very same people who have been criticizing Donald Trump since he first announced he was running for president. And I hate to make everything about Trump, but he is such a good clarifying figure. So a lot of these same former diplomats and national security officials, State Department officials, who've been highly critical of Donald Trump and his kind of ad hoc approach to foreign policy and diplomacy, these are the same people who have been misleading us, who now admit they really didn't know what was happening in Afghanistan. They really didn't know how to fix the problems that they had helped perpetuate. And now we're still in this disastrous war. We had 2 U.S. soldiers killed earlier this month. We had 23 killed in the country last year. Not that anyone in Washington is paying attention. And so you really see this permanent ruling class in Washington at every level just really doesn't know what they're doing.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me in reviewing in great detail the General Flynn interview was he basically showed that there is rampant politicization, as you mentioned, of intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
There's out and out corruption in terms of the billions of dollars and ultimately trillions of dollars that were poured into Afghanistan and where it all went. And then there's the other aspect, which is uncomfortable to discuss, which is the fact that the bureaucracies themselves, like any bureaucracy, has a vested interest in growing bigger, in claiming issues where they may not be there necessarily, or in basically defining a mandate which demands then greater and greater funds, because every government agency and every bureaucracy, period, is subject to those kind of pressures. And bureaucracies don't shrink themselves, they only expand. What did you make of his interview generally?
I mean, he was extremely candid in what he told the interviewers, and he addressed all of the topics you just said: the corruption, the opiate industry that we've also poured billions into, trying to halt Afghanistan's production of opiate and destroy their poppy fields. That's been a complete disaster. And so he really touched on the intelligence, the ongoing corruption, the failure to address all of the other rampant problems there, and the notion that he alerted top officials about this. And so just to give people the timeline, so this would have been between 2012 and 2014 when he was, sounding the alarm. And he basically says in the interview in one passage, if everything seems to be going so great, why does it feel like we're losing? And he was not just telling, and he also was testifying. I couldn't get a copy of it. I believe it was behind closed doors to the Homeland Security Committee in 2015 about this issue too. And so so the Obama people were aware. Mike Flynn was making this public to lawmakers on Capitol Hill and also to the press. So they viewed him as a problem. And as I wrote in my first piece, he really was essentially a whistleblower. And at a very precarious time, so this would have been, around 2012, 2013, 2014, the surge was over. They were bringing troops home. The situation was deteriorating. Joe Biden and Barack Obama were trying to make this sound like a success, but it was not. And for many reasons. And so now we know it's, in worse condition than when Obama and Biden left it, and another mess for Donald Trump to try to clean up.
Yeah, it bears emphasizing the point that you made about General Flynn being a true whistleblower, and you wrote a column
Right.
about this, which is what drew my attention to Flynn's interview. I wasn't even aware that it was in those archives in the first place. He was a whistleblower, and he paid a real price for it. First in the Obama administration, and then subsequently for a short-lived time in the Trump administration. So he should be the one that's really held up as the whistleblower, not the so-called whistleblower that's at the core of a sham of an impeachment process, who will probably never testify, it seems.
No, no, he won't. He's been, protected and heralded as a hero and a martyr. And so we never have to hear from him. Meanwhile, Mike Flynn's life is destroyed. Obama's FBI under Jim Comey, as we now know, opened up an investigation into Mike Flynn. The targeting of Mike Flynn actually preceded any of that. It really started in 2014. So now, we see the unequal fates of two whistleblowers.
Why aren't the Afghanistan papers, in your view, given that it's living history, it remains relevant, and there has never been a lessons learned, it seems, either in the executive branch or the legislative branch on this issue, why aren't they getting more attention?
Well, I think there's a few reasons. One, the Washington Post published this series in the beginning of December. So it was buried amid the impeachment drama and also the Michael Horowitz report on FISA abuse. So I think that was part of it. And obviously, official Washington does not want to bring attention to the documents and interviews contained in that expose. So they are willfully ignoring it. I think that's part of this distraction now with what Donald Trump allegedly said to military officials in 2017 about the war. And these were excerpts from a book that were published in the Washington Post, the same paper that's published the Afghanistan papers. So this almost seems like a little bit of a cover-up for what, these officials are now being exposed as having done. There's not one person to blame as far as the Afghanistan war. I mean, this runs over 3 administrations and hundreds of thousands of officials. So there's not one person to really target here. Although I do have a piece up tomorrow about Joe Biden. we can talk a little bit about that. He's now trying to rewrite history, big surprise, about his role in Afghanistan from the very beginning, 2001, up to the present date. And so it's unfortunate, and that's why we are trying to cover the papers a little bit more to bring more attention, because it really has been buried.
Since you've given us that little tease about Joe Biden, we'll pick it up on the other side of a short break. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show. More with Julie Kelly just after this. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton, and we've been talking with Julie Kelly, a senior contributor to American Greatness, about the Afghanistan papers. I think Julie just made an excellent point that bears repeating, which is that there is no one person to whom we should point a finger at with respect to the morass and, frankly, the failure called a success repeatedly for almost 2 decades of Afghanistan. The fact that it has transcended administrations, secretaries of defense, all manner of generals, folks at every level of government and in the military as well, and that we've ended up in this situation, I think, if anything, speaks to a much more pervasive problem. It would be even better. It would be a much better situation if you could actually point fingers and there would be lessons learned that only implicated a few people and we could make corrective action going forward. But the fact is that it transcends party, year, generation. That speaks to a serious failure that we have currently in our government and in our ability to execute wars to the extent we should be executing the wars that we're entering in the first place. But I want to bring back Julie specifically to talk about something that is coming in a forthcoming column, I believe, and that is how Joe Biden is implicated in all things Afghanistan. So, Julie, take it away.
So, Ben, you'd be hard-pressed to find a politician in Washington who has his fingerprints more on the Afghanistan war than Joe Biden, right? So has been a senator since the 1970s. He was chairman and then ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee. He voted to approve the authorization for the war in 2001. In 2002, he helped co-author legislation that authorized this rebuilding effort that now has cost over $130 billion, more than the Marshall Plan, if you can believe it, in current dollars. And interestingly, in 2007, when he was running against Barack Obama, Joe Biden wanted a new surge of troops, a new influx of troops. He called it a surge into Afghanistan, redirecting troops from Iraq into Afghanistan. Now he's on the campaign trail claiming that he opposed the surge, which there's some details about that he's kind of right, but mostly wrong. Because he did support a surge, just not to the degree that the generals wanted and that Obama eventually settled on. So again, we're getting half-truths from Joe Biden, and I detail this in a column tomorrow.
Half-truths from Joe Biden might qualify as successful, and when you consider his whole record in foreign policy and national security, I mean, I think it's almost safe to say that his only success when it comes with any implications for foreign policy is enriching his family members. Is that accurate?
I think that that's probably true, and I think that that was his interest. And, it would be interesting for somebody to go back and detail how anyone profited off of his continued support of reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan, because he was an early champion of this. And so I'm sure that there's some Biden family members who have profited off of that too. But look, now he's promising to end the war in Afghanistan. Think about this, Ben. If Joe Biden somehow miraculously takes the White House, when he is sworn in, if Donald Trump does not bring all of our troops home, if Joe Biden is sworn in, he will inherit a war that he helped start 2 decades ago, that he has perpetuated, that he has approved. His fingerprints are on every aspect of the Afghanistan war since the beginning. But now he's allowed to, of course, rewrite history and back away from his involvement. And he shouldn't be, especially in light of these reports that we have. It would be great for someone to challenge Joe Biden on the Mike Flynn interview and what he knew about intelligence. I mean, he brags all the time how he is, Barack Obama's foreign policy whisperer. Well, what did he know?
I'm sure that he would challenge the person asking that question to a push-up contest, and that would be the end of it.
He'd say, "Hey, look, Jack, that's not true, Jack. Come on, man. Talk about the facts." His
So
favorite pivot.
we've got about under a minute left. I did want to touch on one more piece that you wrote recently related to this, and that concerns ICIG corruption. That is the Intelligence Community Inspector General, who's implicated in the whistleblower, the quote unquote whistleblower that we talked about before, and bringing his case forth. Tell us a little about that.
So here's the guy at the center. This is the one transcript that Adam Schiff won't release. And this is the transcript closed door testimony of Michael Atkinson, who's the Intelligence Community Inspector General, who kind of helped launch this latest impeachment crusade. He handled the complaint, the whistleblower, I use air quotes, whistleblower complaint. He told Congress that it was a matter of urgent concern, tried to go over his boss's head and bring attention to this. Michael Atkinson is closely tied to many of the key figures in the Russiagate scandal. He worked directly for the head of the National Security Division, which was in charge of handling Carter Page's FISA. He was the chief counsel for Mary McCord, who was the head of that division, who also oversaw the Russian collusion, bogus Russia collusion investigation. And he worked for her for months. He stayed in that agency until he was inexplicably approved by the Republican Senate to serve as the watchdog for an intelligence community that's been trying to destroy Donald Trump from the beginning. Anyway, my point, and it's in my piece, is that Senate Republicans are smart. That's a big if. Their very first witness, in my opinion, should be Michael Atkinson. Ask him about his role in Russiagate from the beginning, from July of 2016, when all of this really started happening, until he left at the end of 2017.
Here. And we're going to have to leave it right there, Julie. Thank you so much
Sure.
for coming on the program. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show. Back just after this.